Brian, we're talking about writing a story set in 1947. Very different time, very different way of speaking from some of the movies and books I read. I mean, a lot of that is probably stylized, but what's your approach to writing dialogue from a different time?
Um, Dialogue for me was kind of easier. I think a lot about the way my grandfather would speak. Um, I think about maybe like friends' grandparents and things like that that really stuck with me from childhood. And my grandfather was probably born in, I want to say 1914. So, he had that style that just stuck with him. And that's what I think about. Um, while I was writing this, I thought a lot about my grandfather. World War II era. Coming back. Having my dad as a kid. The way he would probably speak, the way they would do things. So I just thought about like a lot of like catchphrases and things like that. So it wasn't really too hard. I kind of went with my gut. Um, I think the hardest part really about dialogue was I did just a little bit of Googling, actually YouTubing, I should say, for a Lithuanian accent.
Ooh,
So,
interesting.
yeah. So, there is a part where we have Lithuanian drug dealers. And it was kind of interesting just listening to the accent really and then figuring out how would they say English because you can't say a sentence that I would typically say the same exact way when you're coming from a foreign country, and we all know that. So if you're gonna just write your dialogue just like any American person that's speaking, it's not gonna be realistic. I think there's just choppy ways of doing it. You cut out maybe uh like prepositions or things like that, just different things that you would take out of the language. So I wish
Okay.
I had a script on me right now. I could be an example of something, but
But yeah, these are obviously people who, they weren't born here. They're maybe, from World War II, a lot of people were displaced. Um,
right.
so we're talking about something fresh.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
And I don't think prepositions was really the right word, but there's different things that you take out of the language. So again, I can't really think of a good example, but it's shorter, it's more staccato, I think, of
Okay.
a rhythm than the way we talk. So
Like if I were to speak Spanish, I wouldn't know what the hell I was doing, even though I took a couple years of Spanish.
right, yeah, exactly.
It's funny. I can pretty much understand it if I listen to it, but then it's time to speak. I don't know. It's a difficult thing. It's a very difficult thing to learn another language and to be thrust into that atmosphere.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah. All right, neat. And I know when I read like Dashiell Hammett or some of those old film noir detective books or watch some movies, there's always some some witty dialogue.
yeah.
Um,
I think of Raymond Chandler a
yeah.
lot when I read. I'm just like, so I think that too kind of prepared me for a lot of this. Just reading, like The Big Sleep or what's the other one? Goodbye, My Lovely.
Mm-hmm.
So that that really, I mean, really, if you look at Chandler's work and then look at what I'm doing, it's probably going to be a huge inspiration in the writing. So it's
Good.
definitely
I
there.
look forward to it because the writing back then was so good, and not just dialogue, but also the stories. They were about human beings. They were very human stories. They were moral stories for the most part. I think because of they had some kind of code they had to follow.
Yeah, I mean that's part of it. I think the other thing too was just it was you're limited with film back then with special effects and all
Mm.
those things where we just kind of litter the screen with everything blowing up or things that they couldn't do that easily back then. They had to blow up a real car. So you had to have a solid script. Whereas now, sometimes the script is secondary or maybe in, third place to everything else. And we're kind of like, well, it was good movie visually, but it just it wasn't good writing. And that's what they had back then. They had writing as the backbone. So
Yeah.
that's that's why there was a lot of creativity with the script too, because it was like it better be written well, otherwise people are going to be bored. So I respect that, and I think some movies that we talked about earlier was like Sunset Boulevard, or just seeing the adaptation of like the picture of Dorian Gray, things like that, where I think there's a belief that people had that maybe acting wasn't as good back then. But when you had these incredible scripts and you had really good directors and really good actors, I think that doesn't always ring true. I think they've they've had some incredible work back then.
I
With
love movies from that era. I mean, Billy Wilder, Sunset
Yeah,
Boulevard. I recently watched The Apartment, Witness for the Prosecution. I watched maybe a weekend or two ago.
okay,
So good, just amazing. His writing, I think he was probably one of the best in Hollywood at that
yeah,
time.
absolutely,
Great storyteller, and just human stories. I mean, they had a little bit of, I guess, what was tending towards a blockbuster
hmm
feel, especially with Witness for the Prosecution being a British courtroom drama. Um, but still, that's very different from what we have these days. And I like that you said a script is the backbone, because I've heard a script described as a blueprint, um, but then people, they don't build it to specification, so it doesn't quite fit. But I've heard it say that the script is the skeleton, and everything else is the meat, the skin, the organs. So it's just without that skeleton, it falls apart. Got to have a
I
good script.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Because you can have really great actors, and if you have a script that just delivers these lines that don't work, and I've seen it. I've even seen it with recent independent stuff I've seen on Amazon Prime or something like that, where it's just like that these people are great actors, but the lines just aren't working, or they're doing
Yeah.
the best they can, and they're kind of nailing it, but you can tell that the actual written dialogue is weak. And that's something that you really want to look for in the script. You want to make sure you eliminate all the weak dialogue before you start shooting.
Definitely. I remember when I was starting, um, I would take scripts that either friends had written or that I had written, and I'd pretty much go through everything. And I cut out anything that wasn't necessary, anything that I felt was repetitive. I'd combine things, I combine lines, and that's just starting out. I mean, now it's a bit more instinctual. Like I know I have to hit this here, but
Right.
starting out, it's very much pare it down to what's absolutely necessary. It's not about having someone have this verbose dialogue and speak for like 2 minutes straight. That's almost the opposite of what you want. You don't want to
Yeah.
spoon feed. You don't want to throw everything on
Yeah.
the
Too
plate.
much ambition. And
And
I've
that's what
got
it is. It's good to have ambition, but craft is all about doing it.
well, yeah, because you got to think about when you're writing dialogue, you got to think about, instead of, like I said, too much exposition. You want to go and think about what they're really saying behind the words. So they're kind of, as human beings, we're masking what we're saying. You know, um, just trying to think of something offhand. Maybe you want another piece of cake, and you're not saying I want another piece of cake. You're saying, isn't that cake good?
Yeah, it's all
You're expecting
subtext.
someone else to say, well, you want another piece. So it's not saying exactly what the person is wanting. And so you have the intentions in the actors, really, in their eyes, or in their, a different part of their face or body language. And that's really what's supposed to be delivering. So I can't remember who it was. I was just reading an article, and they were saying about, almost like you can write a whole movie without dialogue. Um, and that's what it is, because a lot of the acting is the body language, facial expressions, and then the dialogue's really more about what's not being said, I feel, and that's something to kind of look for, because when I was writing, I think my very first independent film, DC, um, it was just it was verbose. And I realized when we started delivering these lines, even when I was delivering them as the writer, I was like, oh, and again, acting in that role, I was like, that's a mouthful, and you got to learn to get a rhythm and cut it down to make it concise.
Right. You gotta say more with less.
Right, exactly. So, yeah, it's all about just the learning process, I guess, because when we all do our first film, we kind of we think we know everything. We think it's going to be a great script and great dialogue and all those different things, but then we learn, it's a learning process, and I think it's the best film school you could actually get is doing your own films, your first film, because you could go to school anywhere like from 2 to 4 years for this stuff, and you're not learning everything. You're just not until you're actually doing your own film that you're putting your own money into, or someone else's money, that you're like, yeah, you start realizing what you need to do. Everything from pre-production with the script throughout, filming and post-production. You realize what works, what doesn't work, and what you can hopefully do better next time. So.